Somewhere in a courthouse archive in western Pennsylvania, there is a sealed box that has not been opened in over 130 years. It holds the original field notes of a coroner's investigator named Harold Fenwick, who was removed from his position within 3 weeks of the Johnstown Flood of 1889. His dismissal was never explained. His notes were never added to the public record. The 17 witnesses he had already spoken with before losing his job were never called to testify before any official body. Of those 17, 9 died before the end of that same year. Not from the flood. The flood was already over. More than 200 people drowned in Johnstown on the afternoon of May 31, 1889, when a dam owned by one of the most exclusive private clubs in America gave way and sent 20 million tons of water crashing through the Carnegie Valley. The story you have been told is that it was a terrible accident, the result of negligence, poor engineering, and a season of heavy rains. What the investigation was forbidden to publish is something far more disturbing than an accident. Before we continue with the story of Johnstown and the men who owned the water above it, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and let us know what state or city you are listening from tonight. We want to know how far this channel reaches. Now, let's go back to Pennsylvania, to the spring of 1889, back to a valley that should never have been filled with that much water in the first place. The truth about Johnstown did not die with the flood. It was buried quietly, methodically, and with the full cooperation of people who had far too much to lose. To understand what happened on that May afternoon, you first have to understand what Johnstown was and what it was not. By 1889, Johnstown was a thriving industrial city of roughly 30,000 souls, built into the narrow floor of the Carnegie Valley in the mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania. The Allegheny ridges rose steeply on all sides, and 2 rivers, the Little Carnegie and Stony Creek, converged right at the city's heart before joining the larger Carnegie River to the west. The geography was intimate and enclosed, the kind of valley that gave a place its character, its tight community feeling, its sense of being sheltered from the broader world. It also made it a trap. Johnstown had grown up on iron and steel. The Cambria Iron Works dominated the local economy, employing thousands of men who labored in the mills from before dawn to after dark, shaping rails and structural beams that built much of the eastern United States. The workers who filled the city were largely immigrants: Welsh, Irish, German, Hungarian, Czech, men who had come to Pennsylvania with nothing and built lives in the narrow streets that climbed the valley walls. They lived in row houses close to the water. They had little reason to think about water at all beyond the floods that came in wet springs. The ordinary kind, the kind that sent mud into the first floors of low-lying homes and passed in a day or two. They knew, not in the way that people know things they choose not to dwell on, that there was a dam 14 miles up the mountain. They knew it was old, that it had been repaired more than once, that people sometimes said things about it when the rains were heavy. But Johnstown was a city of practical people, people whose days were consumed by the demands of furnace and forge, of raising children in crowded neighborhoods and stretching modest wages across the week. The dam was a problem for other people to worry about, and there were, in fact, people who worried about it. Engineers who had written letters, inspectors who had filed concerns. Those letters and concerns had all reached the same destination. They had reached the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was, in the plainest terms, a retreat for the wealthiest men in America. Its membership list reads like a catalog of Gilded Age power. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, Henry Clay Frick, the coke baron, who would become one of the most hated employers in American labor history. Andrew Mellon, the banker whose family would shape Pittsburgh's financial landscape for generations. Robert Pitcairn, the regional superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and dozens of others. Lawyers, judges, railroad executives. Investors, whose wealth in aggregate represented a staggering portion of the American economy. The club had purchased the old Western Reservoir and its earthen dam in 1879, intending to refill the lake that had once sat behind it and create a private recreational paradise in the mountains. The lake, which they named South Fork Lake, but which locals called the Club Lake, was stocked with bass imported from Lake Erie. There were 16 cottages, a clubhouse, and a boat launch. In the summer months, members and their families arrived by private rail car and spent their days fishing, sailing small boats, and dining in a fashion entirely removed from the industrial world that their investments had built. The dam that held all of this, the dam that held the lake, was a deteriorated earthen embankment that had already failed once in 1862 and had been repaired cheaply, and, in the judgment of at least 4 different engineers, inadequately. When the club acquired the property, further modifications were made. The discharge pipes were removed and never replaced. The spillway was reduced in size and fitted with a fish screen that regularly clogged with debris, and the central ridge of the dam was lowered by several feet to allow a carriage road to cross it. Each of these modifications reduced the dam's ability to handle large volumes of water. Each of them was documented at one time or another by people who understood exactly what they were looking at. And still the water rose every spring. And still the club's members took their private rail cars up the mountain for another season. Among the year-round residents who worked the property, the caretakers, the groundsmen, the men who maintained the cottages through the winter, there was a man named Patrick Rafferty, the head groundskeeper, a stocky Irishman in his late 50s who had worked at the dam since the early years of the club's ownership. Rafferty was not an engineer. He had never attended any technical school. But he had spent more hours looking at that dam than any of the men who owned it, and what he saw in the spring of 1889 made him deeply uneasy in a way that he struggled to articulate to anyone who might have been able to act on it. The spring rains that year had been extraordinary. May 1889 was the wettest month in years across western Pennsylvania. The rivers were running high. The reservoir was fuller than Rafferty could remember seeing it, and the water continued to rise. He watched the spillway struggling under the load. Choked by the fish screen, water sheeting across the top of the road in ways it had never done before. At least not that he had seen. He sent a message to the club's management on May 28th. He sent another on May 30th. He was not entirely certain what he was asking them to do. He was not certain they could do anything quickly enough, if they had wanted to. What he was certain of by the morning of May 31st was that the dam was going to fail. May 31st, 1889, began like most spring days in western Pennsylvania. Overcast, the air thick with moisture, the smell of rain already in the ground. By mid-morning, the rain that had been falling for 2 days was intensifying rather than easing, driven by a storm system that had stalled over the region. The streams feeding into the reservoir were running white. The lake surface, which on summer days was the color of slate and glass, was now a churned gray sheet advancing steadily toward the crown of the dam. Patrick Rafferty had not slept. He had spent the early morning hours watching the water, walking the top of the embankment in the rain, listening to sounds he could not name, a deep, low trembling in the earth beneath his feet that might have been thunder echoing off the ridge lines, or might have been something else entirely. The fish screen in the spillway was hopelessly clogged. He and two other workers had tried to clear it in the dark hours before dawn, wading into the freezing overflow with rakes and bare hands, and had failed. The water was coming over the road in a sheet several inches deep and deepening. Shortly before noon, Rafferty sent a young worker, a 17-year-old from the village of South Fork named Daniel Coyle, on horseback down the mountain to warn the communities in the valley below. Coyle was not the first such messenger that spring or even that season. Warnings about the dam had been sent so many times over the years that there was a phrase in Johnstown for them, crying the lake. Most people had stopped listening. When Coyle arrived in South Fork Village, he warned the telegraph operator, a man who relayed messages down the valley. By early afternoon, some of the warnings had reached Johnstown. They were, as they had always been, largely disregarded. At 3:10 in the afternoon, the South Fork Dam failed. It did not fail dramatically in a single explosive moment. It failed from the center, in the way old earthen dams do. The water finding a soft path through the embankment, widening it, the earthen core softening, and then simply giving way. Within 45 minutes, the entire dam had been swept aside, and the lake, a body of water roughly 2 miles long, a mile wide, and in places 60 feet deep, was moving as a single mass down the Conemaugh Valley. The wave struck Johnstown at approximately 4:07 in the afternoon. It arrived not with the sound of water, but with the sound of the mountain. Survivors described it as a roar that seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, from the ground and the air at once. A sound unlike anything they had heard. Not thunder, not a train, but something older and more absolute. Those close enough to see it before it struck described a wall of brown and black moving debris. Entire houses, locomotives, freight cars, trees, animals, the compressed material of 14 miles of a populated valley, moving at speeds survivors estimated at between 30 and 40 miles per hour. The wave struck and destroyed and moved on in a matter of minutes. When it was over, Johnstown was gone. 209 people died. Many of them were never found. Many who were found were identified only by fragments of clothing or jewelry. The scale of the loss was so enormous that it overwhelmed the capacity of any organized response for days. And in that interval, in the smoking, debris, choked ruin of what had been a city, the people began to emerge from wherever they had survived, and to make sense of what had been done to them. The relief efforts that arrived in the days following the disaster were genuine and substantial. The American Red Cross, in only its second major operation, arrived under Clara Barton, who would remain in Johnstown for 5 months. Money and supplies poured in from across the country and from abroad. The outpouring of public sympathy was immediate and enormous. What came more slowly, and what shaped the darker history of what followed, was the question of accountability. In the first weeks after the flood, newspapers across the country ran editorials calling for prosecution of the club's members and management. The Pittsburgh papers were particularly aggressive. The logic seemed straightforward. The club had owned a structurally compromised dam, had been warned about its condition by engineers and by their own employees, had made modifications that reduced its safety, and had failed to take adequate corrective action. 200 people were dead. Someone had to answer for it. The legal proceedings that followed were, in the dry language of the courts, inconclusive. The Pennsylvania courts ultimately found that the flood was an act of God, a phrase that was doing very heavy lifting in that particular judgment. Given that several of the wealthiest men in America had been managing the structure that failed, not a single member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ever convicted of any crime. Not one paid $1 in court ordered damages to any victim or family. When the club quietly dissolved in the years following the disaster, its members dispersed back to their mansions in Pittsburgh and their counting houses in New York, largely untroubled. What they left behind in Johnstown was not merely a ruined city. They left a community that understood, with a clarity that required no legal verdict, exactly what had happened and who was responsible. That understanding settled into the bones of the place, passed from parents to children, shaping the particular quality of mistrust that visitors to Johnstown sometimes noticed in the decades that followed. A reflexive skepticism toward institutions, toward the official version of events, toward the men in Pittsburgh who spoke of the disaster in the past tense long before the people of the valley were finished grieving. And then, underneath that communal understanding, preserved in the memories of survivors and in documents that never quite made it into the public record, was something that even the most aggressive newspaper coverage had never fully examined. It had to do with the weeks before the flood, with what the club's management had known, and when they had known it, and with a series of decisions made in the last days of May 1889 that went far beyond ordinary negligence. The man who came closest to uncovering this was Harold Fenwick. Fenwick was a deputy coroner from Cambria County, a methodical man in his early 40s who had worked as a surveyor before entering county service, and who brought to his coroner's work the same habits of documentation and measurement that had shaped his earlier career. He was not political. He had no particular connection to the labor movement or to the reform causes that were beginning to reshape American civic life in that era. He was simply a man who believed that the dead deserved an accurate accounting. In the weeks after the flood, as the official investigations were being organized and the legal machinery was beginning its slow turn toward exoneration, Fenwick was conducting his own methodical inquiry. His mandate was technically narrow: to document the causes of death for the victims within his county's jurisdiction. But Fenwick was the kind of man who followed threads wherever they led, and the threads he found in those weeks: interviewing survivors, examining the debris fields, reviewing what little documentary evidence had survived the waters, led him in a direction that the official investigation was carefully avoiding. He began to hear things about the last week of May, about what had been known at the dam, about communications that had been sent and communications that had not. The official narrative of the South Fork Dam's failure was, at its core, a story of natural catastrophe compounded by engineering negligence. A too heavy rainfall meeting a too old dam. This was accurate as far as it went. The problem, as Fenwick was discovering in the late summer of 1889, was how far it went. Before we go further, because this story is only getting darker, if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. This channel exists to tell the stories that the official record buried, the stories that the people with power preferred you never hear. Subscribe. Leave us a comment with your theories about what the South Fork Club really knew. And let's keep going into the valley together to understand what Fenwick was doing and why it threatened the men it threatened. You have to understand something about the nature of the official investigation that was running in parallel with his own. The Pennsylvania legislature convened a joint committee to investigate the causes of the flood, beginning in July of 1889. The committee included several men with connections to the Pittsburgh financial world, one of whom had business dealings with Robert Pitcairn of the Pennsylvania Railroad, himself a club member. The American Society of Civil Engineers sent its own delegation to examine the dam site and render a technical verdict on the causes of failure and the legal proceedings that began in the Cambria County courts in the autumn of that year were presided over by judges who operated within a political culture thoroughly saturated by the influence of the same industrial magnates whose property had destroyed the city. None of this necessarily means that any specific act of corruption occurred. Institutions can fail through the accumulation of ordinary deference, through the habitual instinct of officials to interpret ambiguity in favor of the powerful, through the reasonable reluctance of men of middling station to make powerful enemies when the outcome of their actions, the legal outcome, the official outcome, is likely to be the same regardless. The courts would almost certainly have reached the same conclusions, even if every man on every committee had been a model of disinterested public service. The law of 1889 Pennsylvania, as it applied to questions of property liability and natural disaster, was simply not equipped to hold wealthy men accountable for the structural choices they made on private land, even when those choices killed thousands. But Fenwick was not working within those institutional constraints. He was working outside them, and outside them in the fall of 1889. A different picture was taking shape. The first thread he pulled was the testimony of a woman named Agnes Driscoll, a widow who had operated a boarding house in South Fork Village. Driscoll had survived by climbing to a roof and then to a nearby hillside, and she had returned to her ruined property within days. What she told Fenwick in a deposition he recorded in his field notebook was that in the 2 days before the flood, she had seen men she did not recognize arriving at the dam on horseback. Not the usual workers, not Rafferty and his crew, but men in better clothing. Men who rode with purpose and left quickly. She had assumed they were engineers or club officials, come to assess the situation. She thought nothing of it at the time. Fenwick noted this and moved on. But over the following 2 weeks, he heard variations of the same account from 3 other residents of the South Fork area, a farmer named Josiah Kern, who had watched from his upper pasture as riders came and went along the dam road, a young woman who worked in the club's kitchen and had been dismissed from her position in early May, and a retired telegraph operator named Samuel Pitts, who had been the one to relay Coyle's warning down the valley, but who also told Fenwick, with some hesitation, that he had transmitted other messages in those final days. Messages originating from the club's property, directed to addresses in Pittsburgh that had struck him at the time as unusually specific about the dam's condition. Pitts could not recall the exact language of the messages he had transmitted. He processed dozens of messages each day, and the flood had been weeks in the past by the time Fenwick reached him. But he was clear on one thing. The messages were not routine operational communications. They were urgent, and they were addressed to men whose names Pitts recognized from the newspapers, men who appeared on the membership lists of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Fenwick asked Pitts directly if he retained copies of the messages he transmitted. Telegraph operators were not required to keep copies of private messages in the ordinary course of their work. But some did, out of professional habit or personal caution. Pitts told him he had retained nothing. His logbooks from that period, which would have shown, at minimum, the volume and frequency of traffic he transmitted in the days before the flood, had been reviewed by a representative of the Western Union Company in the weeks after the disaster. That review was framed as part of a routine damage assessment. Pitts's logbooks were taken for examination and never returned. Fenwick noted this without comment in his field notebook, but in his private correspondence with his brother. In law, he was more explicit. The telegraph records, he wrote in September of 1889, appear to have been made unavailable at the same time as they would have become most relevant. This was one of the moments in Fenwick's investigation where the individual threads, each explicable on its own, began to form something that felt less like coincidence and more like architecture. He pressed further in other directions. He located a carpenter named Thomas Geary, who had done repair work on the club's cottages in April, and who mentioned in an offhand way that 2 of the cottages had been cleared of valuables in the 3rd week of May. Furniture moved to storage, decorative items packed and removed, which Geary assumed was an early seasonal closing. Fenwick noted that this was 3 weeks earlier than the club's usual end of season date. He found a stable hand named Carol, first name not preserved in any surviving record, who had worked for one of the club's permanent staff, and who told him that in the week before the flood, several of the horses that usually wintered at the club's stable had been moved down to South Fork Village, ostensibly for shoeing, but the stable hand thought it unusual because the horses had just been shod 2 weeks prior. He located a woman named Nora Sweeney, who had been employed as a laundress at the club and who had been abruptly dismissed from her position in mid-May, 2 weeks before the flood, with 1 month's wages in lieu of notice, an unusual arrangement that she had assumed reflected some dissatisfaction with her work, though she could identify nothing she had done to merit it. She had been one of 3 domestic workers let go in that same week. When Fenwick attempted to find the other 2, he discovered that one had returned to County Cork, Ireland, and the other had moved to a boarding house in Altoona whose proprietor had no forwarding information. He also, in the course of his work, found something he had not been looking for: the personal journal of a 12-year-old girl named Clara Nunnally, who had survived the flood by clinging to a floating section of roof, and who had been staying with relatives in South Fork Village at the time of the disaster. Clara's journal, which her mother had entrusted to Fenwick after he interviewed the family, contained an entry dated May 29th, 2 days before the flood, that described, in a child's direct and unanalytical language, watching a group of men in good clothing arrive at the edge of the lake in a wagon and stand looking at the water for a long time before leaving quickly without speaking to anyone she could see. They looked worried. Clara wrote. One of them kept taking his hat off and putting it back on. They left before I could see their faces. None of this was conclusive. Each individual detail could be explained. Cottages got cleaned at odd times. Horses got moved for any number of reasons. Domestic workers got let go for all manner of reasons that employers rarely explained. Telegraph logbooks got lost. And men in good clothing visited properties they had an interest in during seasons of concern. Children watched things and misinterpreted them. But taken together, assembled in the careful columns of Fenwick's field notebook, they described something that looked less like negligence and more like preparation. Preparation for something that the club's membership knew was coming. The question that kept Fenwick awake, that he wrote about in increasingly direct language in his private notes, was simpler than any of the evidentiary details. It was this: if these men knew the dam was going to fail, what did they do about warning the 200 people in the valley below? The answer, as far as Fenwick could determine, was nothing organized, nothing systematic, or nothing remotely commensurate with what they apparently understood the risk to be. He was 3 weeks into this inquiry, preparing to request formal depositions from several individuals whose names had come up repeatedly in his research, when he received notice that his services as deputy coroner were no longer required. The notice was bureaucratic in its language, as such things always are. Fenwick's position was described as redundant following a reorganization of the county coroner's office. He was thanked for his service. He was given no formal explanation beyond that. The timing, October of 1889, less than 5 months after the flood, struck him as particular, and he said so to at least 2 people, including his brother-in-law, a printer in Altoona named George Hadley, who would later recall those conversations in some detail. The county coroner who oversaw the reorganization that eliminated Fenwick's position was a man named Bernard Cross, who had been appointed to his position in 1887 and held it through the mid-1890s. Cross was a Republican Party loyalist who had strong ties to the Cambria County political machine, which in turn had close relationships with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The same railroad whose regional superintendent was a member of the South Fork Club. This is not to say that Cross acted at anyone's direction, or that any conversation about Fenwick ever passed between men of influence and the county coroner's office. The documentary record does not support that claim, but it is to note that in 1889 Pennsylvania, political and economic power moved in patterns that did not require explicit instruction. Men who understood the landscape understood what was wanted from them and delivered it, and received their considerations in the ordinary course of business. Fenwick did not immediately surrender his investigation. For several weeks after his dismissal, he continued to work on his own, interviewing people at his own expense, organizing his notes, attempting to find a newspaper or a political official who might be interested in what he had assembled. This is when the situation began to take its more troubling shape. The first person to rebuff him was an editor at the Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette, a man named Eldon Harp, who listened to Fenwick's account, reviewed several pages of his notes, and then told him that the paper was not in a position to pursue this line of inquiry at the present time. Harp was not rude about it. He was, Fenwick noted in a letter to his brother-in-law, apologetic, genuinely apologetic in a way that suggested the refusal was not his preference. He looked at the pages for a long time. Fenwick wrote, and then he looked at me for a long time, and when he spoke, it was in the tone of a man explaining why he cannot swim across a river, not in the tone of a man who has decided he does not wish to. The Pittsburgh newspapers in 1889 existed in a particular relationship with the men whose names appeared on the South Fork Club's membership roster. Carnegie and Frick and Mellon and Pitcairn were not merely subjects of coverage. They were, in various ways, the economic substrate on which the entire Pittsburgh press depended. Their advertising money, their political connections, their relationships with the paper's owners. These were not abstract considerations. They were the daily reality of publishing in a city that those men largely owned. A newspaper editor who ran an aggressive investigation into the club's foreknowledge of the disaster was not simply challenging powerful men on a single story. He was threatening his publication's access, his publication's revenue, and potentially his publication's relationship with the political figures whose cooperation made journalism in Pittsburgh possible at all. This was a calculation that could be made in a matter of seconds, without any explicit communication from anyone, by any sufficiently experienced editor in the city. Fenwick tried 2 other papers. He received similar responses, polite, regretful, but immovable. At one of them, a junior reporter spoke to him briefly after his meeting with the editor, in the corridor outside, and told him in a low voice that the paper had been approached in the weeks after the flood by a representative of one of the club's larger membership investors, and asked, not demanded, asked politely, in the manner of a request between parties who both understand the circumstances, to ensure that its coverage of the disaster focused on the relief and recovery efforts, rather than on questions of legal accountability. The junior reporter did not know the name of the representative. He had not been in the meeting. He was telling Fenwick what he had heard in the office. Fenwick then attempted to bring his notes to a state assemblyman from the Johnstown district, a man named Robert Cassidy, who had been among the most vocal early voices calling for accountability. Cassidy had given speeches on the floor of the assembly calling for criminal prosecution of the club's members. He had been quoted in papers across the country. He met with Fenwick twice in October of 1889. After the second meeting, he stopped responding to correspondence. When Fenwick called at his office in Harrisburg in November, he was told the assemblyman was unavailable. A clerk, speaking quietly in the manner of a man exceeding his instructions, told Fenwick that Assemblyman Cassidy had received a visit from certain interests and that his position had become more nuanced. Robert Cassidy was re-elected in 1890. He did not make another public speech about the Johnstown Flood. In December of 1889, the telegraph operator Samuel Pitts, one of Fenwick's most significant sources, died of a stroke. He was 51 years old and had been in apparently good health the previous autumn. The farmer Josiah Kern had moved by the end of the year. His farm sold. His whereabouts unknown to those who had known him in the South Fork area. Agnes Driscoll, the boarding house operator, had left Johnstown for relatives in Ohio. The laundress Nora Sweeney had by that time already returned to Ireland. A letter to her Johnstown address returned unopened. Fenwick was not a man given to melodrama. His private correspondence, which his family preserved in a small collection that eventually found its way into a Pennsylvania historical society, is notable for its measured quality, its resistance to the sensational. He was trained as a surveyor, a man who dealt in measurements, in fixed points, in the careful establishment of where things were relative to one another. He brought that temperament to his grief and his frustration, and the result is correspondence that is even now more affecting for its restraint than any more demonstrative account would be. But in a letter dated January 1890, writing to his brother-in-law in Altoona, he expressed something that reads differently from the careful documentation of his field notes. "I do not know," he wrote, "if I am being made to feel foolish by coincidence alone, or if coincidence has had some assistance. What I am certain of is that the men who own that dam have a great deal of money and a great many friends. All men that I have neither, and that this is not a situation in which those facts can be ignored for long. I think of the 17 people I spoke with in the autumn, and I count the ones I can no longer reach, and I keep arriving at the same number. And I do not know what to make of it. I do not know that there is anything sinister in it. I know only that I keep arriving at that number." By the spring of 1890, Harold Fenwick had gone quiet. He returned to survey work. He moved his family to a house in the southern part of Cambria County, away from Johnstown. His field notes from the flood investigation, the 17 depositions, the observation logs, the columns of compiled testimony, disappeared from the public record. His brother-in-law later said he had given them to Fenwick to keep for him, but that Fenwick had eventually said they were lost in a move. There is one other piece to this. In March of 1890, a fire destroyed a portion of the South Fork Village building that had housed the telegraph office, a building that also contained, in a back room used for storage, boxes of old equipment and office materials from the operations of the previous years. The fire was attributed to a stove that had been left burning. No one was injured. The building was rebuilt within the year. Among the materials destroyed, according to a brief note in a local newspaper's coverage of the incident, were various papers and records of the telegraph station. What exactly Harold Fenwick knew, and what had been done to prevent that knowledge from reaching the public, is a question that the surviving documents can only suggest and never answer completely. But the shape of what he found, reconstructed from his private correspondence, from his brother, in Law's later recollections, from the fragments of testimony that have surfaced in various historical collections over the decades, points toward a conclusion that the courts of Pennsylvania never reached, and that no official investigation ever examined. And that conclusion begins with a set of decisions made in the final days of May 1889, at a private club on a mountain, by men who understood exactly what they were holding above a valley full of people. If this story is already giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark American history. Hit that like button to help us keep telling these stories, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in Johnstown. Because what the investigation was forbidden to publish goes deeper than any of us expected. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club held its last full meeting of the spring season on May 26, 1889. This is a matter of established historical record. Several members' diaries confirm it, and the club's own limited surviving documentation references it. What has received less examination is what was discussed at that meeting, and what decisions were made in its aftermath. To reconstruct this requires moving carefully between documented facts and the testimony Fenwick collected. Testimony that was never formalized, never entered into any legal proceeding, and that must therefore be treated with appropriate care. But the pieces, arranged in sequence, form a coherent and deeply disturbing picture. By May 26th, the lake behind the South Fork Dam was at its highest recorded level. The rainfall that month had been extraordinary, approximately 6 inches in the first 3 weeks of May alone, with more coming. The club's management, including its president and several of its more technically minded members, had received assessments of the dam's condition from at least 2 people with engineering backgrounds. And those assessments were not encouraging. To understand the weight of those assessments, you have to understand what the club's modifications had done to the dam's safety margins. When the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had built the original dam in the 1840s as part of a state canal system, it had included a system of iron discharge pipes running through the base of the embankment, and these pipes served a critical function. They allowed the reservoir's water level to be controlled, raised and lowered as needed, rather than relying entirely on the spillway to handle excess water. If the pipes were opened during periods of heavy rainfall, the lake's level could be maintained below dangerous thresholds, regardless of what the weather was doing. When the club acquired the property in 1879 and set about refilling the lake for recreational use, the discharge pipes were in poor condition. Repairing or replacing them would have been costly and would have required engineering work that the club's management preferred to defer. The pipes were removed. The openings in the embankment were filled. No replacement discharge system was ever installed. This single decision, made years before the flood, and for reasons of economy and convenience, meant that by May of 1889, the only way to reduce the water level in the lake was through the spillway. And the spillway, as Rafferty and his crew knew better than anyone, was not equal to the task the weather was now presenting it. There was a second modification that bore on the disaster. The spillway's width had been reduced during the club's reconstruction of the site, and a wooden fish screen had been installed across it to prevent the base imported from Lake Erie from escaping into the downstream rivers. This screen, in the conditions of May 1889, was a catastrophic liability. The surging water carried with it enormous volumes of debris, leaves, branches, vegetation from the banks, that lodged against the screen and clogged it repeatedly. Rafferty and his men had cleared it multiple times in the days before the failure. Each time it clogged again within hours. In the final night before the dam gave way, the screen was so thoroughly blocked that almost no water was passing through the spillway at all, even as the lake continued to rise. The men at the May 26th meeting knew about the screen. They had been told about it. Whether they understood its full implication in the current conditions is something the historical record cannot establish definitively. But the engineering men among them, and there were engineering men among them, understood enough about hydraulics and about earthen embankments to draw the relevant conclusions. The discharge pipes were gone. The spillway was undersized and liable to clog. The lake was at its highest recorded level and rising. More rain was forecast. The embankment's structural quality had been questioned for years. What those facts added up to, for anyone willing to do the arithmetic, was a situation with a very limited range of outcomes. What the men at the meeting knew. This is the question that Fenwick was driving toward, and that the official investigations conspicuously avoided, because the answer to that question determined everything that followed. Not whether the dam failed, which was ultimately an engineering and meteorological matter, but whether the people downstream had any warning that was proportionate to the risk those men understood existed. Fenwick's notes, as reconstructed from his surviving correspondence, indicated that he had obtained testimony suggesting the meeting of May 26th included a direct discussion of the dam's safety, a discussion in which at least one member with engineering knowledge stated plainly that the dam could not hold under the current and projected conditions. This was not unanimous. Other voices argued that the dam had held before in difficult conditions and would hold again. There was discussion of dispatching workers to attempt emergency repairs on the spillway, clearing the fish screen, reinforcing the road across the embankment's crown. There was discussion of what could be done. The carpenter, Thomas Jerry, whose testimony about the cottage valuables Fenwick had recorded, also mentioned something else. Something he had considered unrelated at the time, and mentioned only as an afterthought. He had been summoned to the club property on the afternoon of May 26th to make minor repairs to a window frame in the main clubhouse. While waiting in the hallway for an attendant to bring him the necessary materials, he had heard, through the closed door of what he understood to be a meeting room, the voices of several men in what sounded like a heated discussion. He could not make out most of what was said, but he heard clearly the words, "If it goes entire, and that is God's doing, not ours." He did not know who said it. He did not know the full context. He had not thought of it again until Fenwick asked him, with the careful patience of a trained investigator, to describe everything he had seen and heard on his visits to the club property in the weeks before the flood. He recounted it without apparent understanding of its significance. Fenwick, in his field notebook, underlined it twice. The decision that emerged from that meeting, or rather, the absence of a decision, is what Fenwick found most damning. No organized warning was sent to the communities below. No request was made to the county or state authorities to evacuate the valley. No systematic effort was made to alert Johnstown or the other towns in the Carnegie watershed that the people who owned the reservoir had reason to believe it represented an imminent mortal threat. The one action that was taken, sending workers to clear the spillway screen and attempt to stabilize the road, was taken too late and was, as Rafferty's own desperate assessment had indicated, insufficient for the scale of the problem. And it was the action of men who hoped, against the math, that the situation might still resolve itself without catastrophe. Instead, A small number of private arrangements were made. Valuables from the cottages, as the carpenter Gary had noted. Horses moved, as the stable hand Carroll observed. Telegrams sent to individual members in Pittsburgh, apparently notifying them of the situation in language that permitted, if one chose to read it that way, an interpretation of normal seasonal concern rather than imminent catastrophe. The quiet, efficient management of the club's own exposure to the consequences of a failure that its leadership had reason to believe was coming. Or there is a phrase in the literature of disaster and institutional failure: normalization of deviance. That was not available to Harold Fenwick in 1889 because it would not be coined for another century. It describes the process by which organizations, over time, come to treat dangerous conditions as normal simply because those conditions have not yet produced their worst consequences. Every season that the South Fork Dam held, despite its compromised spillway, and its missing discharge pipes, and its reduced embankment crown, was a season that made the next season's decision to do nothing slightly easier. The men who owned the club had been making these decisions for a decade. The dam had held for a decade. It was possible, genuinely, humanly possible, for men of wealth and education to look at those 10 years and draw from them conclusions that were catastrophically wrong. But, better the rain, does not sound like the words of a man whose assessment of the risk had been normalized into comfortable blindness. It sounds like the words of a man who sees the risk clearly, who has calculated the alternatives, and who has chosen the one that costs him least. Better the rain. Better 200 dead than a managed failure that proved foreknowledge. This is what the investigation was forbidden to publish. Not a supernatural conspiracy, not a secret society or a coded scheme. Something more ordinary and therefore more terrible. The logic of men who had too much to lose, who understood the situation clearly, then who chose the option that best protected their position, and who were then protected by law, and by money, and by the careful management of public memory from any accounting for that choice. The legal proceedings that followed have already been described. The court's finding for God and against the survivors, the members dispersing to their comfortable lives, the charitable donations that closed the moral account, without opening the legal one. But there is one more element of the aftermath that the official narrative has never fully examined. In the years following the disaster, the South Fork Valley above what had been the dam site was quietly purchased. The land changed hands several times through intermediary buyers until it was held by a timber company with no obvious connection to any of the club's former members. The timber company logged the area thoroughly in the 1890s, removing most of the standing trees, and with them most of the physical evidence of the dam's original construction and modification. By the time any organized historical investigation of the site became possible, in the early 20th century, the landscape had been so thoroughly altered that many of the specific features that had been described in pre-flood engineering assessments were impossible to locate with certainty. This may have been simple commercial activity, unconnected to any desire to manage the historical record. Timber was valuable, and the hills of western Pennsylvania were being logged comprehensively in those years. It may be coincidence that the one area of particular relevance to the history of one of America's worst industrial disasters was also the area that was most thoroughly stripped of its physical evidence in the decade following that disaster. Harold Fenwick, had he still been investigating, would have noted the coincidence. He would have written it in a careful column, without editorial comment in his field notebook. And then he would have underlined it. The city of Johnstown was rebuilt It took years, and it was never quite the same city that had existed before May 31st, 1889. The Cambria Iron Works reopened. New houses went up on the valley floor. People came back, and people stayed, and the city continued as cities do, carrying their losses in their architecture, and in the particular silences that certain subjects produce in certain rooms. For many of the survivors, the years after the flood were shaped by a peculiar combination of gratitude and fury that never entirely resolved into either. They were grateful to be alive, grateful for the outpouring of relief that came from across the country and from as far as Europe. Grateful for Clara Barton and her nurses, and for the thousands of strangers who sent money and food and clothing. And they were furious. A fury that had nowhere to go, because the courts had spoken and the law had spoken, and the men who were responsible had been found, in the eyes of the legal system, to be responsible for nothing. This fury expressed itself in the ways that grief without legal outlet tends to express itself. In the stories people told their children, in the particular bitterness with which certain names were spoken, in the refusal, which became a kind of community tradition, to purchase Carnegie steel products when other options were available. It was small and practical and utterly without effect on the trajectory of any of the men involved. But it was something. It was the only thing that was left to do. Patrick Rafferty, the groundskeeper who spent the last night before the flood walking the embankment and listening to the earth move beneath him, who sent Daniel Coyle down the mountain with a warning that arrived too late to make any practical difference. Rafferty died in 1892, and he gave no interviews in the years between the flood and his death. Those who knew him in South Fork said he was not a man who talked much about that night, or about what he had seen, or about the messages he had sent and the responses he had not received. He drank more than he had before. He went to Mass every morning, which he had not always done. These are the accommodations that men make with the things they carry. Daniel Coyle, the 17-year-old who rode down the mountain with the warning, survived to old age. He gave a single recorded interview in the 1920s to a local newspaper. When asked whether he felt he had done everything he could, he said yes. He had done what he was sent to do. When asked whether he thought the warning could have saved more people if it had been sent earlier, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said, "There was a time when it could have saved everyone, but that time had passed before I rode." The South Fork Dam was never rebuilt. The lake drained completely in the hours after the failure, leaving a broad mud flat where the water had been. And over the following decades, the forest reclaimed it. Today, the site is part of the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, maintained by the National Park Service. You can walk the outline of where the dam stood. You can see the ghost of the lake bed in the vegetation patterns of the valley floor. There are markers and interpretive signs and a visitor's center that tells the story of the disaster with the careful, measured language of official commemoration. It is a quiet place, the kind of place that does not announce what happened there, and the memorial does not include a marker for Harold Fenwick. Harold Fenwick's sealed box, if it exists, has not surfaced in any archive that historians have publicly documented. It may be exactly what the oral tradition around it suggests, a box of notes from an investigation that was shut down before it could reach any conclusion. It may contain evidence that would, even now, after a century and a third, clarify the degree of foreknowledge that existed in the last days of May. It may contain nothing more than the documentary detritus of an inquiry that ran out of time and authority before it could assemble its case. Or it may simply be a story, the kind of story that communities tell themselves about their wounds, that gives shape and agency to catastrophe, that replaces the unbearable arbitrariness of disaster with the more bearable, yet more enraging, narrative of human choice and human betrayal. But here is what is not a story. The South Fork Dam was structurally compromised, and the men who owned it knew it. Engineering opinions to this effect were delivered and documented. The modifications made to the dam after the club acquired it reduced its safety margins in ways that experts warned about at the time. In the final days before the failure, the club staff on site clearly understood that a catastrophic failure was likely, and the communications sent in those days clearly reached club leadership in Pittsburgh. And yet, no organized warning, nothing proportionate to the scale of the risk, was sent to the people in the valley below. Whether this represents criminal negligence, conscious decision-making, or some more complicated mixture of denial and self-interest, and the particular moral failure of people who have spent their lives being insulated from the consequences of their choices. That question was never formally adjudicated, and now never will be. What was adjudicated in the slow court of public memory is something different. The names of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club's members remained associated with the flood for the rest of their lives. Carnegie's philanthropies, the libraries, the concert halls, the endowments, were sometimes received with gratitude and sometimes with a coolness that had to do with what people remembered. Carnegie himself acknowledged the flood only obliquely in his autobiography, written near the end of his life. He did not describe the May 26th meeting. He did not discuss the engineering assessments his club had received. He wrote of the disaster as something that had happened, that had been terrible, that the community had eventually recovered from. He moved on quickly to other subjects. Frick, who was confrontational by nature and made no apologies for anything, survived being shot by an anarchist in 1892 and died in 1919. Having spent the intervening decades accumulating one of the great art collections in American history, now housed in the museum in New York that bears his name. The Frick collection is one of the finest small museums in the world. His connection to Johnstown is not among the first things visitors are told. Mellon rose to become Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents. Pitcairn retired in comfort. Not one of them ever publicly addressed what had been decided or not decided at that last May meeting of 1889. The 17 witnesses that Harold Fenwick interviewed in the autumn of that year scattered and diminished in the ways that people do. Some died as people die, some moved as people move. The specific cluster of departures and deaths in the months following Fenwick's dismissal may be coincidence, as such things usually are. Or it may be something that the surviving documents suggest, but can never prove. What the Johnstown flood asks us to consider, what it has always asked beneath the official story of rainfall and earthen embankments and inadequate spillways, is what we are willing to examine about the relationship between private wealth and public safety, between the men who hold the water and the people who live below it. That relationship did not end in 1889. It has continued in different forms, at different dams, in different valleys, in every era since. The particular men of the South Fork Club are long dead. The particular lake they held is gone. But the structure of the decision, the logic of better the rain, the preference for catastrophe over accountability, is not a historical curiosity. It is a recurring feature of how concentrated power behaves when its interests and the public interest come apart. 209 people drowned in Johnstown on the afternoon of May 31, 1889. Their names are preserved in the memorial records. Their faces appear in the photographs that survived with the particular clarity of people who did not know what was coming. Working faces, ordinary faces, The faces of people who had been told by their circumstances not to worry about the water above them. Harold Fenwick wanted to tell them, wanted to tell their surviving children and their grandchildren what had really happened. He did not succeed. Whether he was stopped by the specific actions of powerful men or by the more diffuse weight of a system in which powerful men rarely needed to act directly to achieve the outcomes they preferred, we cannot now say with certainty. What we can say is that he tried, that he spent his autumn of 1889 in the ruins of a city interviewing people who had lost everything, assembling a record that no court ever received and no newspaper ever published. And that somewhere in western Pennsylvania, in an archive or a courthouse or the back room of a building that has changed hands several times in the intervening century, the possibility exists that his field notebook is still there, waiting in a sealed box in the dark, holding whatever it is that the investigation was forbidden to publish. This mystery shows us something that history has demonstrated again and again, that the distance between negligence and decision can be very small, and that the men with the power to reveal that distance are often the same men with the greatest interest in obscuring it. The sealed box, if it exists, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that official records are assembled by people with interests, and that what a community remembers and what the record preserves are not always the same thing. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that Harold Fenwick found what it sounds like he found? Do you think the "better the rain" account is credible? Or is it the kind of thing that communities invent around their worst injuries? Do you think the sealed box exists? And if it were opened today, what do you think it would contain? Leave your comment below. We read every single one of them. And your theories matter to how we tell these stories. If you found this story compelling, and if you think more people should know what the official history of Johnstown left out, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark American history. The stories we tell here are the ones that didn't make the final cut of the official record. The ones that got sealed in boxes, reassigned, lost in moves, that burned in fires that no one quite explained. They deserve to be heard.